The charity cart struck the frozen courtyard stones so hard that one will split apart, throwing sacks of flour, jars of broth, and an elderly tenant woman into the snow. Eliza March ran from the abandoned kitchen before the horses had stopped screaming. 3 thin adult laborers lay beside the overturned cart, their hands blue from cold, while Mrs. Wren clutched an empty bread basket against her chest as though it were the last thing she owned. The old woman had walked 4 miles because the manor's promised food had not arrived. Behind the wrecked wheel, a clean saw cut shone through the broken wood. Someone had not merely stopped the deliveries. Someone wanted the tenants to believe the estate had abandoned them. Eliza dropped to her knees, her narrow frame nearly swallowed by her plain wool coat, and pressed 2 fingers beneath Mrs. Wren's jaw. A pulse answered, weak but steady. She ordered the men who could stand to carry the injured into the kitchen, then pulled off her own gloves and wrapped them around the old woman's frozen hands. That was when she saw the envelope beneath the spilled flour. It bore a foreign postmark, the name of the estranged heir, and a black streak where someone had tried to burn it without breaking the seal. Whatever was written inside that letter had frightened someone enough to wreck a charity cart on Christmas week. Now, you might wonder why a woman with no title, no fortune, and no authority would risk herself for a manor already considered ruined. Eliza could not have answered then. She only knew that hungry people had arrived at her door, and she had spent too many years watching respectable families call abandonment a private matter. The abandoned kitchen had once been used for preserving game and baking bread for harvest crews. Now its ovens were cracked, its copper pans green with neglect, and its shelves held more dust than food. But it was warmer than the snow, and Eliza made it work. She laid Mrs. Wren near the stove, boiled water, and divided the last pot of barley broth among the injured. One laborer tried to refuse his cup. "Give it to someone worse off," he murmured. "You are someone worse off," Eliza said. She opened the half-burned envelope above the steam. The letter was not from the heir. It was from a solicitor in Liverpool, written to warn him that his cousin, Silas Vale, had challenged his inheritance. Unless the heir returned in person and presented himself before the estate trustees by noon on Christmas Eve, the manor's lands, rents, and remaining accounts could pass into Silas's control. There were 6 days left. A second page contained something worse. The trustees believed the manor had failed its tenant obligations for nearly a year. Food allowances had vanished from the ledgers. Winter coal had never been delivered. Charitable payments bearing the estate's seal had been recorded, but no tenant had received them. The estate was not simply dying. Someone was making it appear faithless. Eliza looked around the ruined kitchen at the injured adults warming their hands over cups that should have been filled weeks earlier. The heir had fled overseas after his father's disgrace. He had answered no ordinary letter. She could not leave the estate to find him, and now she knew her correspondence was being intercepted. But accounts could speak where pleading failed. If she restored the missing deliveries, traced the stolen funds, and sent proof through a route Silas did not control, the heir might finally understand what would be lost if he stayed away. A shadow crossed the frosted window. Eliza folded the solicitor's warning into her apron just as a lantern appeared beyond the kitchen yard. Then another. Men were walking toward the door through the snow, and one of them carried the manor's official seal. The first man through the snow carried the manor seal in one gloved hand and a folded notice in the other. Eliza knew him as Silas Vale's steward, Mr. Crowther, a careful man with a narrow mouth and the habit of entering rooms as though he had already purchased them. 2 estate watchmen followed him into the yard. Neither drew a weapon, but both stood close enough to the kitchen door to make their purpose plain. Crowther looked at the broken cart, the flowers staining the snow, and the injured tenants warming inside. "This building is condemned," he said. "No stores are to be issued from it." Eliza remained in the doorway, blocking his view of Mrs. Wren. Those stores were promised. Promises made under the late master's accounts are under review. Hungry people cannot eat a review. His eyes moved to the open envelope, near the steaming kettle. For one brief second, his polished calm slipped. "You have opened correspondence that was not addressed to you." It was found beneath a sabotage card. An unfortunate accident. The axle was sawn. One of the watchmen glanced toward the broken wheel. Crowther did not. He raised the notice. The manor seal hung beneath the writing in dark red wax. According to the page, the abandoned kitchen and every remaining provision inside it were to be locked until the inheritance question was settled. Eliza studied the seal before she read the words twice. The crest was correct. The pressure marks were not. For 3 years, she had served beside the former mistress whenever household letters were prepared. She had watched the old seal descend hundreds of times. Its chipped lower edge always left a crooked break beneath the stag's front hoof. This impression was smooth. A copied seal could still frighten servants and tenants. It could empty a kitchen. It could make theft look lawful. But it could not change what Eliza knew. "You may leave the notice," she said. Crowther's expression hardened. "You misunderstand. I am closing the room. Then you will close it around 6 witnesses, 3 injured laborers, and 1 elderly woman who nearly froze because this estate failed to keep its word. The trustees will hear that you resisted lawful authority. They may also hear that you tried to turn sick adults back into the snow." Silence held the yard. Crowther finally stepped nearer and lowered his voice. "You were a companion, Miss March, not a housekeeper, not a steward. Certainly not a trustee. Do not mistake being overlooked for being powerful." Eliza felt the old words find their mark. She had spent much of her life in rooms where her usefulness was expected and her presence ignored. She had carried trays, copied letters, tended headaches, and listened while families discussed her future as though she were a chair that might be moved. But Mrs. Wren coughed behind her. Eliza did not step aside. "No one in this kitchen leaves tonight." Crowther looked past her at the laborers, perhaps judging how much trouble a public removal might cause. Then he placed the notice on the snow-covered flour barrel. "By tomorrow, the doors will be chained." He turned away. The watchman followed, though the younger one looked back at the broken axle before disappearing into the storm. Eliza waited until their lanterns had passed the stable wall. Then she barred the kitchen door. Inside, the room had grown quieter. The injured men had heard enough to understand the danger. Mrs. Wren lay beneath 2 patched blankets, her breathing shallow but easier. She opened her eyes as Eliza approached and tried to sit. "The parcel stopped in October," the old woman whispered. "We thought the new master had forgotten us." "He is not the master yet." "Then perhaps he has forgotten what he was meant to become." Eliza had no answer for that. She added coal to the smallest usable stove and began taking stock. There were 2 sacks of barley, 1 damaged sack of flour, dried apples, salt, a jar of dripping, and enough onions for perhaps 3 days if used carefully. The shelves that should have supplied half the northern tenants were nearly bare. Yet the old account books told another story. She found them in a warped cabinet beneath the pastry table, tied together with faded blue ribbon. The official household ledger listed flour, coal, lamp oil, and meat allowances issued every month. Each entry bore initials proving receipt. Mrs. Wren stared at her own name. "I never signed that." The mark beside it was a neat W. The old woman held up her right hand. 2 fingers were stiff with age, bent inward and useless. "I sign with a cross," she said. Eliza turned the page. The same careful handwriting appeared beside dozens of tenants' names. Different initials, identical slant. Someone had stolen the provisions and forged every acknowledgement. She spread the books near the stove, keeping them away from the damp floor. The kitchen was no longer merely shelter. It was the one place where the estate's broken promises, missing food, and false accounts could be laid beside the people who had suffered from them. By midnight, the laborers were resting. One had a badly bruised shoulder, another a split brow, but none appeared mortally hurt. Eliza boiled strips of old linen, cleaned the wounds, and served the barley broth in small portions. When she offered Mrs. Wren half a slice of bread, the woman tucked it beneath her blanket. Eliza pretended not to notice at first. Then she placed another piece beside the cup. "There will be food tomorrow," she said. Mrs. Wren's fingers tightened around the hidden crust. "People say that when they want the poor to sleep quietly." Eliza sat on the edge of the narrow cot. "Then do not believe me yet. Watch what I do." The old woman studied her for a long moment before taking one bite. Near dawn, Eliza climbed the back stairs to the deserted servants' corridor. The main house stood cold and half-shuttered, its grand rooms stripped of paintings and silver to satisfy creditors. Portrait hooks remained on the walls like small wounds. In the former mistress's sitting room, Eliza found the writing box she had once carried from room to room. Inside lay a ribbon, 3 unused envelopes, and a miniature portrait of the estranged heir taken before he left England. Nathaniel Vale had been younger then, but disappointment had already settled around his eyes. After his father was accused of misusing tenant funds, Nathaniel had refused to defend the estate or himself. He had crossed the ocean, sending only one brief letter declaring that no honest man should inherit a house built on dishonor. Eliza had understood his shame. She had never forgiven his absence. She returned to the kitchen, carrying the writing box, and placed the miniature face down beside the ledger. A simple appeal would never reach him. Even if it did, he might mistake it for another attempt to save the family fortune. So she would send proof. She began a new account in her own hand. On the first page, she wrote the date, the names of the injured tenants, the contents of the wrecked cart, and the exact cut found in its axle. Beneath that, she listed every provision remaining in the kitchen. Then she opened the delivery ledger and started comparing it against the tenants' names. Mrs. Wren watched from the cot. "What will figures do against men like Mr. Crowther? Figures remember what men hope everyone else will forget." At sunrise, 2 more tenant women appeared at the rear door. They had heard about the overturned cart and brought what they could spare: 6 eggs, a crock of milk, and a bundle of dried herbs. Neither trusted the manor, but both trusted Mrs. Wren. Eliza accepted the food only after recording every item and promising its value would be credited. By mid-morning, the abandoned kitchen was working again. One laborer repaired the damaged table. Another cleaned soot from the bread oven. Mrs. Wren sorted onions from her chair, while the tenant women kneaded dough. Eliza assigned no task that exceeded anyone's strength, and every contribution went into the account. The first loaves came out uneven and dark at the edges. No one complained. Eliza divided them by household need, marked each parcel, and placed a written receipt inside every basket. The estate would fulfill its obligations openly now, with witnesses and records that could not be erased by one steward's pen. For the first time in months, smoke rose from the abandoned chimney. It was that smoke that drew the visitor. The younger watchman returned alone shortly before noon. He removed his cap at the door and glanced behind him before entering. "Crowther sent a man to the telegraph office last night," he said. "Orders were given that no message bearing your name or the Vale crest is to leave the county." Eliza closed the ledger. "Who gave the order?" The watchman swallowed. "Mr. Silas Vale." "Why are you telling me?" He looked at Mrs. Wren's breadbasket, now full. "Because my mother's name is in that ledger too." From inside his coat, he pulled a crumpled shipping receipt. It showed that 4 tons of estate coal, recorded as delivered to the northern tenants, had instead been sold to a private merchant 3 counties away. At the bottom stood Crowther's signature. Eliza had found proof of theft. But before she could ask where he obtained it, the manor bell began ringing above the main hall. Not the dinner bell. The alarm bell. Through the frosted window, Eliza saw men carrying lengths of chain toward the kitchen, and at their head walked Silas Vale himself. Silas Vale did not shout when he reached the abandoned kitchen. He brushed snow from the shoulder of his black coat, glanced at the smoke rising from the chimney. and smiled as though he had arrived to correct a servant's small mistake. Behind him stood Crowther, for hired men, and a county clerk carrying a leather case of papers. The chains in the men's hands dragged across the courtyard stones. "Eliza March," Silas said, "you have made a spectacle of my family's distress." Eliza stepped outside and closed the door behind her. She kept the stolen coal receipt folded inside her sleeve and the kitchen ledger beneath her apron. The younger watchman stood near the stable, far enough away to deny involvement, close enough to hear. "The distress belongs to the people who paid rent and received nothing," she said. Silas's smile did not change. He was Nathaniel's cousin by blood, though little in his face resembled the miniature in the writing box. Silas was heavier through the shoulders, carefully groomed, and calm in the way of men who had learned that cruelty sounded respectable when spoken softly. He motioned to the clerk. The man opened his case and produced a petition bearing 2 seals. One declared the kitchen unsafe. The other granted Silas temporary control over the estate's remaining stores until the inheritance dispute was settled. "The trustees cannot allow an unappointed companion to distribute property," Silas said. "Nor can they permit tenants to occupy a condemned structure. They are not occupying it. They are receiving what was already owed to them." "According to whose accounts?" Eliza held up the old ledger. "According to yours." Crowther's jaw tightened. Silas looked at the book, then at the chains. "You may surrender the records now." "No." The word left her quietly, but every hired man heard it. Silas stepped closer. "Miss March, your loyalty is admirable. It is also misplaced. Nathaniel abandoned this house. He abandoned the tenants. He abandoned every person foolish enough to believe he would return." Eliza felt the sentence strike harder than Crowther's warning had. Nathaniel's absence stood behind every empty coal bin and every forged receipt. Whatever crimes others had committed, he had made them easier by leaving. But absence was not surrender, and shame was not proof of guilt. "You do not get to profit from the wound he left," she said. Silas's eyes cooled. He raised one hand, and the hired men moved toward the door. Eliza planted herself on the threshold. Behind her, the laborers had risen despite their injuries. Mrs. Wren sat upright on the cot. The 2 tenant women stood beside the bread table, one holding a wooden peel as though it were a staff. "No one under this roof leaves with you," Eliza said. "No ledger leaves either." Silas turned to the county clerk. "Record that she has obstructed lawful seizure." The clerk dipped his pen but did not write. He had seen the flower cart. He had also seen the line of tenant baskets waiting beside the wall. Silas noticed his hesitation. "Mr. Bell," he said gently, "your position depends upon accuracy." The clerk lowered his eyes and began writing. One of the hired men reached for the door. Eliza did not move. She had no weapon. Only her own narrow body stood between the kitchen and Silas's authority. Then the younger watchman crossed the yard. He stopped beside her, removed the estate badge from his coat, and placed it on the flour barrel. "My mother signed no receipt," he said, "yet her name appears 12 times. Silas studied him with mild disappointment. "You will regret confusing family sentiment with evidence." The watchman looked afraid. His hands shook once before he closed them into fists. Eliza drew the shipping receipt from her sleeve. "Then let us discuss evidence." Crowther took one step back. She unfolded the page and read aloud the date, the merchant's name, the weight of coal sold, and the payment entered under Crowther's signature. The shipment matched coal listed in the estate ledger as delivered to tenant households. The hired men looked toward the steward. Silas did not. "A commercial receipt proves coal was sold," he said. "It does not prove theft. It proves the same coal was claimed twice. Only if the estate ledger is genuine. It was kept in the manor cabinet. By servants. Under your steward's control." For the first time, Silas's smile disappeared. He ordered Crowther to take the ledger. Crowther advanced, but the kitchen door opened behind Eliza. Mrs. Wren stepped into the cold with a blanket around her shoulders and the bread she had once hidden held openly in one hand. She was weak enough that one tenant woman supported her elbow. "My name is written in that book," Mrs. Wren said. "I cannot make the mark beside it." She raised her bent fingers for the clerk to see. The courtyard went still. Eliza opened the ledger to Mrs. Wren's entry. Then she showed the same slanted handwriting beside the names of other tenants. Different initials, one hand. The clerk stopped writing Silas's accusation. Silas turned his gaze on Mrs. Wren. "Madam, you are ill and have been influenced by a woman who needs this disturbance to justify her presence." Mrs. Wren's mouth trembled, but her voice held. "Miss March gave me bread. You gave me a signature." That simple sentence did what Eliza's argument could not. One of the hired men lowered his chain. Another stared at Crowther with open suspicion. Silas understood the danger. He could control papers more easily than witnesses who had begun comparing their suffering. He folded the petition and placed it back in the clerk's case. "The kitchen may remain open until tomorrow evening," he said. "After that, the trustees will decide." Eliza knew retreat when she saw it, but this was not surrender. Silas walked close enough that only she could hear him. "Nathaniel will not come," he said. "And when Christmas Eve passes, every ledger in this house will belong to me. He may come when he sees what you have done. He will see nothing." Silas looked toward the road, where telegraph lines vanished into the snow. "No letter leaves this estate without passing through men I pay." He turned away and led Crowther and the hired men back toward the main house. The clerk followed more slowly. Before leaving the yard, he looked once at Mrs. Wren's hand and then at the false signature in the ledger. The chains remained on the stones. Inside the kitchen, relief lasted less than a minute. Eliza spread the records across the long table and explained the truth in plain words. Silas did not want the estate because he cared for its tenants or even because the house still held wealth. He wanted Nathaniel absent until the deadline passed, because then he could claim the inheritance, erase the stolen provisions, and sell the land before anyone proved how the accounts had been emptied. The kitchen workers listened without interrupting. A gun could not stop that. Only proof delivered before Christmas could. Eliza divided the work. Mrs. Wren and the tenant women would compare every forged receipt against the people who had supposedly signed it. The injured laborers would inspect the remaining delivery carts and record damage. The former watchman would identify merchants who had bought estate coal, grain, and oil. Every fact would be copied twice. One copy would remain beneath a loose flagstone near the cold pantry. The other had to reach Nathaniel. The telegraph office was watched. The main road belonged to Silas's men. Ordinary mail could be intercepted. But the estate's charitable deliveries had once gone through 3 parishes, and one route crossed the Vale property without touching the village post office. If Eliza restored that route, a food parcel could carry more than bread. By afternoon, the kitchen became an accounting room, bakery, and dispatch station at once. Flour dust covered the table beside open ledgers. Dried apples simmered while tenant statements were taken. Every basket leaving the door carried a numbered receipt, and every returning messenger brought names, shortages, or proof of false entries. Fear remained in the room. Some tenants refused to sign anything. One man stood outside for 10 minutes before entering, then left without speaking when he saw Silas's carriage near the hill. Another whispered that Crowther could raise rents, seize livestock, or deny spring seed. Eliza did not call them cowards. Fear had been collecting interest on that estate for years. Near dusk, a retired schoolmistress named Miss Harlan arrived with a bundle of old parish records. She had once helped the former mistress organize winter relief, and had kept duplicate lists when the manor office became careless. Her list showed that 37 households were promised flour and coal. The estate ledger claimed all 37 had received them. Only 9 had. Miss Harlan placed her spectacles on the table and looked at Eliza. I should have spoken months ago. Why did you not? Because Crowther reminded me that my cottage belonged to the estate. Eliza waited. Miss Harlan looked toward Mrs. Wren, who was slowly dividing bread for the next morning's route. Then the schoolmistress signed her name beneath the statement. One witness had chosen truth. Others might follow. That night, Eliza prepared a parcel addressed not to Nathaniel, but to a relief society in Liverpool whose secretary had once corresponded with the former mistress. Inside the flower cloth, she stitched copies of the coal receipt, the forged tenant marks, Miss Harlan's lists, and the solicitor's warning. On the outside, the parcel appeared to contain kitchen records and a sample of preserved apples. The Relief Society could forward the evidence to Nathaniel's last known address without using the Vale name. A tenant wagon was due to leave before dawn. Eliza sealed the parcel with plain wax and no crest. Then the former watchman entered through the back door, breathing hard. Silas knows about the parish route, he said. Crowther has men waiting at the North Bridge. Eliza looked at the parcel in her hands. Before she could answer, something struck the kitchen roof. A second impact shattered the upper window. A burning rag wrapped around a stone fell onto the flour sacks, and flames climbed the dry cloth before anyone could reach them. The burning rag struck the flour sacks, and the abandoned kitchen filled with fire before anyone had time to scream. Eliza seized the nearest wool blanket, plunged it into the wash tub, and threw it across the flames. The former watchman dragged 2 sacks away from the wall while Miss Harlan beat at the burning cloth with a wooden peel. Smoke rolled beneath the rafters. Mrs. Wren stood too close to the heat, clutching the sealed parcel under her blanket. Get outside, Eliza ordered. The old woman shook her head. They came for this. Another stone struck the shutters. This one did not burn. It broke the latch and sent splinters across the bread table. The tenant women pulled Mrs. Wren behind the cold pantry wall. One of the injured laborers kicked open the back door to release the smoke. Eliza stayed near the flour sacks until the last flame was smothered beneath blackened wool. Then she heard hoofbeats beyond the yard. Crowther's men had not come to burn the entire manor. They had come to create enough panic to take the parcel while everyone ran. Eliza wrapped the evidence in oilcloth and pressed it into the former watchman's hands. Use the south track. They will be watching it. Then do not carry it on the road. She pointed toward the old service passage beneath the scullery floor. It had once carried barrels from the kitchen to the ice house and emerged near the walled orchard. The stones were wet, narrow, and half collapsed, but it crossed beneath the stable yard without touching the bridge. The watchman hesitated. What about you? I will give them something else to follow. Eliza took the empty parcel cloth, filled it with worthless kitchen copies, and sealed it beneath her coat. Then she stepped into the courtyard before anyone could stop her. A lantern moved near the gate. She ran toward the east path. The riders followed. Eliza had no horse and little chance of outrunning mounted men. But the snow was deep between the outbuildings, and she knew every abandoned stair and broken wall. She crossed the laundry yard, slipped through the ruined conservatory, and heard Crowther shouting behind her. Take the parcel and leave the woman. His words told her 2 things. He knew exactly what the parcel contained, and Silas had ordered that she be frightened, not killed. Eliza reached the old carriage house and climbed the narrow loft ladder. Beneath her, 2 men entered with lanterns. She waited until they crossed beneath the hay beams, then dropped the false parcel through a broken panel onto the far side of the yard. One rider saw it land and shouted. Both men ran after it. Eliza descended the rear ladder and returned toward the kitchen, but Crowther was waiting beside the orchard wall. He held no gun, only a riding crop and the calm expression of a man who believed resistance had nearly ended. You have mistaken inconvenience for courage, he said. Eliza's breath came hard from the run. Smoke had blackened her sleeves, and one palm was blistered where the wet blanket had slipped. "You have mistaken silence for consent." Crowther looked toward the south field. In the distance, a dark figure moved between the hedges carrying the real parcel. He saw it too. His face changed. Crowther lunged past her, but Eliza caught his coat and pulled with all her strength. Her narrow body struck the frozen ground beneath him. Pain tore through her shoulder. He kicked free and ran toward the orchard gate. The younger laborer from the kitchen stepped into his path. He was still bruised from the wrecked cart, one arm bound against his chest. He did not raise a fist. He simply shut the gate and dropped the iron bar. Crowther struck it with both hands. By the time he climbed the wall, the former watchman had disappeared into the orchard passage. The evidence was beyond his reach. But the cost came quickly. One hired rider, furious at being deceived, set fire to the empty delivery shed before leaving. Flames took the roof, the repaired cart, and half the remaining winter baskets. The tenants formed a line from the pump, passing buckets through the snow until the shed collapsed inward. No one died. But by dawn, the kitchen yard looked like a battlefield fought with bread instead of bullets. Eliza stood before the blackened delivery shed and understood what Silas expected. He believed destruction would make the tenants withdraw. He believed hunger would teach them that truth was too expensive. Instead, Mrs. Wren carried the first surviving loaf to the yard and placed it on the scorched flour barrel. Miss Harlan set her signed statement beside it. Then another tenant arrived with a tax receipt. A widow brought 2 letters showing that her coal allowance had been refused. An older shepherd brought a rent book bearing Crowther's corrections in the same hand as the forged signatures. By mid-morning, there were too many witnesses to silence without making the whole county notice. The relief parcel reached Liverpool 2 days later. Nathaniel's reply did not. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a gray sky. The inheritance hearing was held not in London, but in the county assembly room because the trustees feared the dispute would outlast the holiday recess. Wooden benches filled early. Tenant families, tradesmen, servants, and townspeople crowded beneath oil lamps while sleet tapped the tall windows. At the front sat 3 trustees and the county magistrate. Silas occupied the right table in a dark morning coat. Crowther sat behind him with both hands folded. Eliza entered carrying the rebuilt ledger. Her burned palm was wrapped in linen. Her shoulder ached beneath her dress. Mrs. Wren walked beside her, still thin and pale, but no longer hiding bread beneath her clothes. Nathaniel's chair remained empty. The magistrate called the hearing to order at 10 in the morning. Silas's solicitor spoke first. He described Nathaniel as an absent heir who had ignored notices, failed to manage the property, and allowed tenant obligations to collapse. He produced letters supposedly sent across the Atlantic and returned unanswered. He submitted the official estate ledger showing that provisions had been purchased, distributed, and properly acknowledged. The papers appeared complete. The seals appeared lawful. The dates aligned. Silas did not accuse Eliza of fraud. He was too careful for that. He portrayed her as a well-meaning dependent who had mistaken household disorder for conspiracy. Miss March found hunger, the solicitor said, and in her distress, searched for a villain. But hardship is not theft, and compassion does not confer legal authority. A murmur moved through the benches. Eliza watched the trustees. One looked troubled. Another appeared impatient. The third had already arranged the inheritance transfer papers beside his hand. Then Silas produced the most damaging evidence of all. A signed statement from a Liverpool agent declaring that no parcel or legal notice had reached Nathaniel Vale through the Relief Society. The room seemed to narrow around Eliza. The parcel had escaped Crowther. But perhaps it had never reached Nathaniel. The magistrate looked at the clock. If Mr. Nathaniel Vale does not appear before noon, the trustees may proceed under the terms of the petition. It was 11:15. Eliza presented the coal receipt, the forged tenant marks, and the duplicate parish lists. Silas's solicitor challenged each one. The coal, he argued, might have been sold lawfully and replaced from another supplier. The signatures might have been entered by authorized clerks. The parish list proved promises, not non-delivery. Eliza called Mrs. Wren. The old woman took the witness chair and raised her damaged hand. I could not have written the W beside my name. Silas's solicitor approached gently. Mrs. Wren, Miss March fed you after an accident, did she not? Yes. She sheltered you? Yes. And she told you that provisions had been stolen? Mrs. Wren looked toward Eliza. The solicitor waited for the room to notice. Did Mississippi March place that belief in your mind? Mrs. Wren's courage faltered. Her fingers tightened around the chair rail. Silas watched her without expression, but Crowther leaned forward. The old woman saw him. Her voice disappeared. The magistrate prompted her to answer. She nearly sat back. Then Mrs. Wren looked toward the gallery, where her full bread basket rested in Miss Harlan's lap. No, she said at last. Hunger placed it there. The benches stirred. Still, the magistrate required more than suffering. The county clerk, Mr. Bell, was called to verify Silas's temporary orders and seals. He took the chair pale and rigid. Eliza placed Crowther's notice before him. Did you prepare this? No. Did you witness its seal? Mr. Bell glanced at Silas. Silas said nothing. That was worse than a threat. The clerk's hand shook above the page. I received it already sealed. From whom? His lips parted, but no sound came. Silas's solicitor objected that Eliza was intimidating the witness. The magistrate warned her to proceed carefully. Mr. Bell looked ready to retreat into silence. Eliza did not ask the question again. Instead, she placed the old mistress's writing box on the table and removed 3 genuine sealed letters preserved inside it. Each impression bore the small broken line beneath the stag's front hoof. Then she placed Crowther's notice beside them. Its lower edge was perfect. The manor seal was chipped 7 years ago, Eliza said. Every lawful impression since then carries this break. The order closing the kitchen does not. The magistrate leaned forward. One trustee lifted both papers toward the light. Silas's solicitor answered quickly. A replacement seal may have been commissioned. Then there will be a record of payment, Eliza said. The solicitor turned to the clerk. Mr. Bell stared at the false seal. His breath caught once. Crowther's face had gone still. The magistrate asked whether a replacement had been entered in county records. Mr. Bell looked at Silas again. Silas finally spoke. Accuracy, Mr. Bell. The clerk closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked not at Silas but at Mrs. Wren's bent hand. There was no replacement, he said. The room went silent. Mr. Bell's voice failed after the first sentence. He swallowed and tried again. Mr. Crowther brought 3 documents already impressed. Mr. Silas Vale instructed me to enter them. As provisional orders, I did not witness the seals. I knew the authority was doubtful. Crowther stood. Silas ordered him to sit. The clerk continued before fear could reclaim him. The tenant receipts were also delivered to my office in batches. They were not signed in my presence. Many arrived before the dates on which provisions were supposedly issued. That detail broke the lie. One receipt showed Mrs. Wren acknowledging coal on November 18th. The county register proved the receipt had been filed on November 12th. The acknowledgement existed 6 days before the delivery it claimed to confirm. Silas's solicitor requested an adjournment. The magistrate refused. The trustees began comparing dates across the ledger. Page after page carried the same impossible sequence. Receipts had been sealed, filed, and approved before carts supposedly left the estate. Crowther moved toward the side door. The former watchman and 2 tenant laborers stood from the gallery. They did not touch him. They merely blocked the way. At 11:52, the magistrate declared the estate accounts unreliable, the temporary orders invalid, and the inheritance transfer suspended pending criminal investigation. Silas remained outwardly calm. The deadline still governs, he said. Nathaniel Vale is not present. The clock ticked toward noon. Eliza had exposed the theft. She had not brought the heir home. The magistrate looked at the empty chair and then at the transfer papers. It is 11:58. A bell rang outside. Not the manor alarm. The church bell. Once. Twice. The assembly room doors opened, and a man entered with road mud on his boots. Sea wind still burned into his face, and the scorched relief parcel beneath one arm. Nathaniel Vale crossed the room before the clock struck 12. He placed his passport, the solicitor's warning, and Eliza's stitched evidence on the magistrate's table. "I am here to defend my claim," he said. Silas stared at him. Nathaniel did not look at the transfer papers first. He looked at the burned linen around Eliza's hand. Then he faced the trustees. "My father's disgrace taught me to flee from a name I believed beyond repair. Miss March showed me that an estate is not its silver, its portraits, or its title. It is the promise it keeps to the people who depend upon it." The magistrate asked whether he intended to retain ownership. Nathaniel glanced toward the crowded benches. "Yes," he said, "under audited accounts, restored tenant obligations, and independent oversight." Silas rose slowly. "You came home for a ruined inheritance." Nathaniel turned toward him. "No, I came home because she proved it was not ruined." The magistrate ordered Silas and Crowther held for examination on charges of fraud, theft, and falsification of county records. No cheering followed. The tenants were too tired for triumph. But when Crowther passed Mrs. Wren, she did not lower her eyes. Outside, snow began falling over the courthouse steps. Nathaniel stood beside Eliza as the townspeople departed. For 6 days, she had imagined what she would say if he returned. Now that he had, the questions were too heavy for the public street. "Why did you come?" she asked. Nathaniel looked toward the cart waiting to take them back to the estate. To answer for leaving. It was an honest answer. It was not yet the answer she feared to hope for. Together they turned toward home, while behind them the church clock finished striking noon. The road back to the manor took them through fields where snow had buried the wagon ruts. But every few miles Nathaniel saw proof of what Eliza had rebuilt without him. A cottage window glowed beside a delivered coal stack. A tenant woman carried a numbered flower parcel beneath her shawl. At the northern crossroads, 3 older laborers were repairing the charity cart with a new axle cut from sound oak. No one cheered when Nathaniel passed. Some removed their caps. Others simply watched. He understood that coming home before noon had preserved his legal claim. It had not restored anyone's trust. The abandoned kitchen still smelled faintly of smoke when Eliza entered. One window was boarded, the delivery shed was a blackened frame, and the wool blanket she had used against the fire hung stiff above the wash tub. Yet bread cooled on the long table. Nathaniel stopped in the doorway. For years, he had remembered the manor as polished halls, closed drawing rooms, and his father's name whispered behind newspapers. The inheritance he had fled had seemed built entirely from shame. But this room held no portraits. It held receipts drying beside the stove, tenant lists tied in bundles, 6 repaired baskets, and a pot of soup kept warm for anyone arriving after dark. "This is what you sent me," he said. Eliza removed her coat carefully to protect her injured shoulder. "I sent accounts." "You sent the reason accounts matter." Mrs. Wren, seated near the stove, looked up from sorting dried apples. "You may speak handsomely after you have carried coal," she said. Nathaniel took off his coat. "Yes, ma'am." That afternoon, the estranged heir carried coal. He also reopened the northern storeroom, ordered every lock changed, and placed the keys not in his own pocket, but on the kitchen table before 3 witnesses. The remaining provisions were counted publicly. The missing stores were entered as debts owed by the estate, not favors the tenants should be grateful to receive. Nathaniel asked Eliza to supervise the new accounts. She refused, not because she wished to leave, but because the offer sounded too much like the old life she had endured. Responsibility without recognized authority, labor rewarded by permission to remain. "I will not be another useful woman tucked behind a family name," she told him. Nathaniel did not argue. The following morning, he returned with papers naming Eliza March independent director of tenant provisions and household relief, with a salary, authority over expenditures, and the right to present accounts directly to the trustees. Her appointment did not depend on marriage. It did not depend on affection. It depended on work she had already proven she could do. Eliza read every line before signing. Then she crossed out one clause. Nathaniel looked at the alteration. Why must the position end if the estate changes hands? Because obligations should survive their owner. He considered that, took the pen, and initialed the change. The estate's recovery began in the abandoned kitchen. Tenant debts caused by stolen provisions were suspended. Coal and grain were distributed according to household need, with duplicate receipts held by both sides. Miss Harlan trained 2 adult clerks to maintain independent copies of every account. The former watchman became supervisor of the delivery routes, though he refused to wear the old estate badge. The boarded window was repaired before New Year's Day. The delivery shed took longer. Some damage could be rebuilt with timber and nails. Other damage remained in the body. Whenever a stone struck a roof tile or a log split sharply in the fire, Mrs. Wren still hid bread beneath her blanket. The first time Nathaniel noticed, he looked ashamed. Eliza stopped him before he could speak. "Do not make her explain fear for your comfort." So no one asked Mrs. Wren to surrender the hidden crust. They simply kept the bread shelf full. Each evening, Eliza placed one fresh loaf there. Each morning, Mrs. Wren saw another waiting. After several weeks, she began leaving half of her saved bread untouched. By spring, she no longer hid any. Eliza had a remaining fear of her own. She still checked the road after dark. Nathaniel would sometimes find her at the kitchen window, watching lanterns pass beyond the courtyard as though departure might arrive without warning. She had spent too many years being left behind by people who promised that absence was temporary. He did not ask her to trust him. He stayed. He attended every tenant meeting, even when anger was directed at him. He read the recovered accounts aloud in the assembly room. He sold 2 hunting horses and a collection of silver plate to repay what the estate owed. When the trustees recommended dismissing several elderly tenants to reduce expenses, Nathaniel refused and placed the decision in Eliza's recorded minutes. By summer, the manor had less luxury than before. It also had no hungry tenant households. Silas and Crowther were convicted after the county clerk's testimony was supported by merchant books, forged seals, and the impossible delivery dates. The stolen funds recovered from their accounts repaired cottages, purchased seed, and rebuilt the delivery shed. Nathaniel's father's disgrace was not erased. Some of the missing money had vanished under his neglect before Silas's theft began. Nathaniel stopped trying to defend the dead. Instead, he answered for what remained. One evening in late autumn, nearly a year after his return, he found Eliza preparing the Christmas delivery lists at the long kitchen table. Her burned palm had healed, leaving a pale mark beneath her thumb. He placed a small wooden box beside her ledger. Inside was no ring. There were 2 brass keys. One opened the manor's front door. The other opened the estate record room. "I know this house has asked women to serve it without ever belonging to it," he said. "I will not ask that of you." Eliza looked at the keys but did not touch them. "What are you asking?" "That you choose." He told her the first key could be hers whether she accepted the second or not. Her home would not depend upon her position. Her work would not depend upon loving him. And if she wished to leave, the salary and appointment were hers until she chose otherwise. Only then did Eliza understand that he was not offering rescue. He was offering freedom and hoping she might remain. She picked up the record room key first. Nathaniel smiled. Then she took the key to the front door. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it." "The kitchen door stays open during winter storms." He nodded. "Always." They married the following spring in the village church, with no transfer of authority hidden inside the vows. Eliza kept her own name in the estate records and her own signature beneath every account. Mrs. Wren sat in the front pew with a piece of bread wrapped in cloth inside her bag. She had brought it not from fear, but to share on the road home. Years passed, and the abandoned kitchen was never abandoned again. Its ovens baked for the estate and the surrounding parishes. Its record table became the place where tenants could examine charges before paying them. During severe winters, travelers slept near the stove, and soup remained warm until the last lamp on the road went dark. Miss Harlan's system of duplicate accounts was adopted by neighboring estates. The former watchman trained delivery crews to inspect every wheel before departure. Mrs. Wren lived long enough to see her name written correctly in the ledger, marked not with a forged W, but with the cross she made herself. Eliza and Nathaniel grew older at the same table where she had first spread the evidence. He never asked her whether she had saved the estate for him. He knew better. She had saved it for the people whose names had once been treated as numbers. She had given him the chance to become worthy of returning. Every Christmas Eve, just before noon, Nathaniel carried the first flour sack into the kitchen himself. And every year, Eliza opened the outer door. The first winter, that door had admitted injured adults, cold wind, and a half-burned letter someone wanted destroyed. Years later, it opened onto a line of neighbors carrying apples, coal, ledgers, and bread for those who had less. No one entering was asked whether they had earned mercy. They were only asked what they needed. If this story reminded you that a home is not inherited until its promises are kept, right? Keep the door open in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more frontier stories where quiet courage brings the lost back home.